On today's podcast, I'm talking with Dr. Sohaib Saeed, and you'll have to forgive my terrible Arabic pronunciation. Sohaib is an Islamic scholar who trained at Edinburgh and Cairo's prestigious Al-Azhar University. His PhD focused on intra-Quranic exegesis. He's been the head of research at the Bayyinah Institute, an initiative which teaches Arabic and Islam to a worldwide English speaking audience. And he's the founder and director of the Ashur Centre, which is based in Scotland. Sohaib, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's always lovely to talk to you.
Thanks very much. And listening to your CV, people will think that it's not a typical CV for a Glaswegian boy. And I wonder if you could tell us about a bit about growing up in Glasgow, what that was like, and your journey to becoming an Islamic scholar.
Sure, thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss Islamic scholarship. I think it's something which is not very well understood in our society. Both the great parts of it and the challenging parts of it. And it's nice to connect that a little bit to my own personal exploration. So I've grown up in Glasgow, more specifically in Bishopbriggs, and I went to school here in Glasgow. Eventually went to university in Edinburgh, and always, took an interest in religion. I say always, but at a certain point in my teenage years, became very interested to learn more about the faith that I'm growing up in. Took it more seriously, and at the same time as pursuing my ordinary studies and doing fairly well in school in different subjects, I had an interest in trying to, find myself um, in the bigger meanings of life and what lies behind and what lies beyond, um, as well as just finding a place in terms of identity, being someone who is growing up in a particular time and place and studying a tradition that's very rooted in many centuries of thought, and obviously faith in a world which is dominated by science and technology and the shifting of ideas and cultural norms. It can be very challenging. And I took an interest particularly in the scripture, in the Quran. I wanted to know about what it's saying. I wanted to know about its language. I wanted to know about how it's interpreted and translated. And that's what really my studies have focused on. I first went to Egypt just for short bursts of time, a little bit in Jordan over one summer, in Egypt another summer. And it was when I was doing my master's in philosophy at Edinburgh that I enrolled in Al-Azhar University. So, Al-Azhar, for those who might not know, is an ancient institution in Egypt. It is more than 1,000 years old. It is one of the oldest universities in the world, continues to operate to this day, um, and carries all that weight of tradition while making some moves towards modernization in the 20th century and now. And so I enrolled there in the faculty of Usul al-Din, which is basically theology. I focused on the study of the Quran. This was after having, of course, studied Arabic, both here and there, because I did some
Mm.
Arabic study at Edinburgh University. So
Mhm.
in little bursts here and there, I dipped my toes, and then I took the plunge to study in
Mhm.
more depth. Spent about 6 years overall in Cairo, and after that came back to the UK. Because I already had a master's from Edinburgh, I was able to go straight into a PhD, and this was at SOAS University of London, where I had the pleasure of being supervised by a very respected scholar and a renowned translator of the Quran, Professor Abdul Halim. So I had the benefit of undertaking my research there and did some work after my PhD in the field of academia, with in connection with some universities. Did some teaching at Glasgow, a little bit of tutoring at
Mhm.
Edinburgh, and a research position at Freiburg University in Germany. And then I set up my own center to pursue these academic interests more.
And it seems like you've always been sort of caught between two worlds, and it's really this part that really resonates with me. It's this idea that on the one hand, you've gone through the Western education system, you've been surrounded by secular ideas, and I kind of wonder what that's like in a sense of people sort of coming to you with questions, oh, like, is it true that Islam says this, and is it true that Islam's a extremist religion? And on the other hand, you're really wanting to, or you're feeling the need to travel in order to go and find out the answers to those questions. And I wonder if you appreciate that this is something that a lot of British Muslims are feeling, and what it's like to be kind of caught up between those two worlds.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not sure it's felt like being caught between worlds, but it's about having a complex identity. And um, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that I am a Western Muslim. I think like a Westerner, right? With all respect and love to my Egyptian brothers in my class, I don't think like an Egyptian. Um, I've got that song in my head now, right? Think like an Egyptian. Yeah, walk like an Egyptian. So, I don't think the same in all respects, despite the fact that we share a faith, because I am influenced by my environment, and for some people that might be a negative. They might think about, oh, British Muslims or Western Muslims, or the idea of British Islam, for example, or Scottish Islam, even. It might make some people, recoil at the idea that Islam is localized in any way. But of course, in our history, it always has been thus. Islam spread from its, immediate location in the Arabian Peninsula to far in the east and far in the west,
Mhm,
and it did localize. It's a very interesting and complex history about how that happened, but I don't think we find it too uncomfortable that there is a Malaysian flavor to Islam and a Pakistani flavor to Islam and a Moroccan flavor to Islam.
mhm,
Why should it be uncomfortable to have something like that which pertains to Britain or America or Australia, and different parts of the world? So just understanding that we are obviously products of our environment, and we might gravitate to aspects of the faith that make best sense for the way that we see things, the way that we do things.
mhm,
I like to think about Muslim cultures and subcultures, and the fact that we should have a multicultural approach to Islam. There isn't just one way of doing it. There are
mhm,
personal preferences, there are cultural preferences, there are practices that might be allowed in the faith, but people in certain cultures don't really feel that that fits with them, right? An example that comes up is polygamy, for example, a man taking more than one wife at the same time. Um,
mhm.
in some cultures and some times as well, that may make perfect sense. That may be a very sensible approach. It might be something that works for some families. But for myself, for example, I find that very hard to envision, because this is not
Yeah.
how I'm brought up. It's not how I feel about marriage. It's not how I see the world. So that's not an absolutist kind of view. It's not being absolute and universal about your values. It's recognizing that Islam as a faith,
Mhm,
as a religion, as a way of life, is guided by scripture, revelation, the example and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But
mhm,
there's so much flexibility within that. Um, and for me, going to the East, as it were, and going to study in Egypt, and particularly in Al-Azhar, was because I did want to get the highest authority of knowledge that I could access. And I didn't feel it's enough to just go to some institutions within this
mhm,
country, although I do think that it's important to build up our local institutions so that you don't
mhm,
have to go abroad to study. I just feel that we're probably not at that point yet where we can say we have really solid scholarly institutions in Britain and in the West generally. We have
mhm,
institutions that are growing to meet that need. One of the things that perhaps uh, a person most would need to go abroad for is for the Arabic language, because the Arabic
Mhm.
language is an important resource to understand Islamic scholarship.
Mhm.
It's not necessary to be a
You've
Muslim, but it is necessary in
mhm.
order to really pursue the intricacies of Islamic scholarship.
I want to stick with this idea of the cultural adaptation of religion in different places because I think it's really interesting. Your polygamy example. For example, that's something which to Western ears sounds absolutely kind of this is a sign that Islam is a backwards faith and all of the rest of it. Um, and they might see you trying to explain it away in order to adapt to the culture. But what interests me is that that's not what you're saying. You're not trying to explain it away. You're trying to say, well, actually, Islam has always had this framework for adapting to certain cultures. When you went to Al Azhar, what was it about being there and accessing that knowledge that made you think that that was a correct interpretation and that it wasn't like you were just trying to explain away all of the hard things that people might criticize
Mm.
Islam for?
I mean, I've maintained my kind of philosophical interest, and I like to look beyond what people are saying to try to think about why they're saying it and what assumptions lie beneath them. And so, when some people are very uncomfortable about polygamy, for example, I think they should be more ready to examine their own reasons behind that. Are they rational reasons? Are they moral reasons? Or are they really cultural reasons and matters of taste and reaction? And I can't imagine that idea. Does it represent something backward, or is it actually are things also turning in certain directions now in Britain? Yes, marrying more than one person is not legal at all, but it's not illegal to have multiple partners. And there's plenty of talk about polyamory and new families, and you know, if anything, Islam is far more conservative in these respects. But on the matter of marrying more than
Mhm,
one person is more progressive. So it's it's an interesting kind of dynamic also to put these labels about conservative versus progressive, etc.
mhm,
Ultimately, Islam is a very the expression sometimes used, a broad church, um, or Islam is a broad mosque, let's say, which encompasses
mhm,
many possibilities. So the fact that something is allowed in Islam doesn't mean that everybody has to do it. We
mhm,
just have to, if you like, not condemn it. Like if we see that God and His Messenger didn't rule something out, then we don't condemn it. We just might say
mhm,
it's not to my taste, it's not to your taste. And honestly, when I studied in Egypt, um, it's not that I had the sense that here I have the authentic religion represented by Al-Azhar, because Al-Azhar also is,
we could get onto that in a little bit
yeah, I
as
mean, it's a
well.
locally uh, rooted institution, and naturally, it is also affected by culture. It is also affected by modernity and the good and the challenges that modernity brings. There is a lot of apologetic discourse within Islamic scholarship and teaching, and that's okay. But we just have to recognize things for what they are.
Mhm,
Sometimes you encounter realities and facts that could be uncomfortable to a person studying in depth, and then we have to make sense of those things. Um, you can hand wave and ignore things, or you can turn away, or
mhm,
you face these things head on. How to understand scripture that was revealed in the 7th century
mhm.
in contexts, cultures that are very different from those ones. Um, this is actually what we need to rise to.
And I'm thinking about the culture because we're speaking a lot about cultures, and the impression that I think listeners will be getting is that this seems very complicated. It's not just straightforward and simplistic. And I wonder about, for example, I grew up with many people who had the same sort of upbringing as me, trying to navigate the complexities of, well, can I be Muslim and get a mortgage? Can I be Muslim and date? How do I get into a marriage in a culture where that's maybe not as socially acceptable? And a lot of people, they end up leaving Islam. They end up thinking, oh, this is all very silly. Whereas somebody like me has, you know, actually found a way to reconcile those things with faith. I wonder about how, you have gone away to Al-Azhar and studied. You have studied Islamic studies within a Western context as well. How do do you feel like you can help modern Muslims navigate some of those things? And I'd be interested to know what your thinking is about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think I will take one step back before coming to this, just to say something about what it means to be a Muslim scholar, because we have different kind of roles to play. What I have been talking about is largely sort of the academic pursuit, and to some extent within even a university context and research. That's really where my interest lies. And then, um, you may see others who are much more rooted in community needs,
Mhm,
and within institutions like the mosque. So, for someone to be an imam, for example, an imam is basically a prayer leader, but the imam has a broader role than that in providing leadership to the community, in answering their questions, in helping them with their issues, in providing teaching, in providing counseling, even. And the mosques have this huge potential, and sometimes they're fulfilling that potential, to really gather people around a meaningful
mhm,
engagement with their faith. I have a little, uh, pastoral role, you could say, in some of the mosques that I'm connected with, and also in Edinburgh University, where I have been part of the chaplaincy team for around 10 years. But mostly, I don't, you know, I don't see myself as equipped to really
mhm,
engage with people and their problems as much as some other people are. And that's actually a bit of a difference, I think, with the expectations and the training that people in some other religious traditions undergo. Because I came to
mhm,
realize through speaking to um, certain, priests or ministers, different kind of titles that people have, but people who are leaders in other religious communities, including Christian communities, that they might not undergo that much theological training. That is not
mhm.
that is part of what they do, but it's not the really defining factor that they are theological scholars. But they would undergo a lot more training in the other aspects of what allows them to be vocational religious leaders. Whereas,
Applied theology rather than theoretical.
yes, and then also all the practicalities that
Mhm,
enable them to serve the community. In a Muslim context, that is not really the norm, unfortunately. So,
mhm,
I, for example, went and studied. I undertook my degree. No part of that degree was about serving the community, how to serve the community. So that's stuff that you have to either figure out or undergo some other type of training to do it. So imams in the mosque sometimes have those qualities and have maybe some training, but we don't have a great systematic way of producing this kind of scholar. You have some institutions that are trying to fill that gap, um, but largely we are sort of overqualified in theology and in my case, Quran interpretation. So I'm perfectly at peace with that because I know what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to provide, which
mhm.
is specialism in this particular area, how we read the Quran, how we understand it, how its interpretation continues to, uh, I could say, continues to
Mhm.
evolve in the sense that it's a growth in our tradition. Um,
Yeah.
and when it comes to answering people's questions and the problems that they have, yes, I mean, I fully believe that the Quran provides a great deal of the answers to that, and everything that a person needs in their faith. But then uh, we need some help sometimes to bring that out and to clarify it, and
Mhm.
including when someone is struggling to understand something in the Quran, they might see that and become perturbed by it. And if they don't have someone to ask, they could go away, eventually just drift off from the faith, or quietly or loudly. But what they
Mhm.
needed was just an intelligent conversation at an earlier stage where they could say, "Hmm, when the Quran mentions such and such phenomenon," like I'm just because I brought up the polygamy example, it's going to keep coming up now, right? So
Yeah. We don't have to
four,
stay
four,
stuck to
four
that
times is the
example.
maximum I'll mention it, right?
Yeah.
So the so they will see that, for example, and feel a bit bothered by it, for example, due to their own cultural positionality, and because they don't meet someone or listen to
Mhm.
someone who who explains it and contextualizes it in a way that clicks with them, they might end up, this might end up becoming a problem for them on an individual level.
Mhm.
So yes, I absolutely believe that people who, like myself, go and study at Islamic institutions, maybe in the East, maybe in the West, wherever it may be, we have a tremendous responsibility, um, and it helps that we have been there. We've grown up in the
Mhm.
same environment, and we're conscious of what needs to be said, what needs not to be said, what how to say what needs to be said is very important.
Mhm.
To think about the various audiences that listen to you. Sometimes you say something, you don't realize that there's other people listening who weren't your first intended audience. Like, say, for example, you're talking to a room of men, and maybe the sisters, the Muslim women are in the other room, and you forgot that they were there, and you said something which unintentionally was insensitive, and
Mhm.
then the women listening could go away with a message that you didn't mean to say, but they just received the message of, oh well, we're not respected, you know and this kind of thing happens a lot. You hear stories about it,
Mhm.
and it's very important to really be conscious of where people are in the time and place that we live.
I think that's a really good point at which to start talking about homegrown scholarship, because this is one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation, because you've been involved in initiatives like the Bayyinah Institute, which is Nouman Ali Khan's sort of initiative to try to educate the American Muslim population, like originally, but is now worldwide. You have institutions like the Cambridge Muslim College, which has been set up, and I see these things as like really trying to address what seems to me like an intellectual crisis within Britain's Muslims. So to go back to the Quran, people have questions about the text and then don't have people to ask those questions to. Similarly, non-Muslim listeners will, might their only knowledge of the Quran might be, oh yeah, well, there's this verse about killing all the unbelievers, or there's this verse about, and that is their only experience of what Islam is about. Um, because you have grown up in this country, do you see yourself as better placed to start having some of those conversations? And I wonder if you could make a comment about how you see these initiatives in the great scheme of things,
Yeah, yeah,
because it seems to me like we might be entering a new era.
yeah. I mean, there are so many different types of initiatives and beneficial organizations and projects springing up here and across the pond and around the world. And we are more and more a globally connected community, right? The sense of being a Muslim ummah, a one nation. Um, and we are also part of our wider societies. So, for example, you mentioned Cambridge Muslim College. I'm not directly connected, but I've had the opportunity to go there a few times and to speak there and to speak with people. Um, and that is a place where people are undergoing um, degree studies, and some of them undertaking diplomas. And one of the purposes that that was set up, as I understand, is to solve that problem that I discussed before, that people could be trained in theology but then lack some of the pastoral aspects of training, and understanding the context of what it means to be a religious leader in Britain. So that is something that they have have provided some targeted courses for people who are graduating from some of the um, UK-based seminaries, because there are UK-based seminaries, sometimes called Darul Ulum, which belong to certain segments of the Muslim community and Muslim scholarship. And I think a lot of people coming out of those seminaries actually recognize that they have some way to go in order to
Mhm.
be in order to actualize their benefit and potential for the
And do
community.
they experience any backlash from maybe more traditional communities for having been trained in a sort of modern Western way?
I don't know that they do. I don't know, but I think that it should be self-evident that the more that you sort of have this complementary approach, you take the
Mhm,
best of what has been done before, that's traditional approaches, let's say, and you mix it with the things that are very here and now. I think that that is always going to be the best winning combination, because you want the sense of rootedness and authenticity, and that there's a scholarly tradition that you are taking from. But we also need to be very conscious about the questions of here and now. So some of the teaching that I do in some of these online institutes, I'm covering Quranic sciences, I'm covering Quranic studies, I put it that way, and I'm thinking about what debates are happening on Twitter these days, or whatever it's called
mhm,
now, X, right? So we see the things that people are asking about and debating about on YouTube. We need to not follow every last trend, but we need to be aware that you can't just say I can't just tell the students what's in the books and not
mhm,
relate it to what they're seeing and hearing around them. So yeah, I think these have a lot of potential to lift Islamic discourse. We really need to encourage the best kind of conversations. We need to encourage the hard conversations, the
mhm,
inward facing ones. Even speaking here on a public channel, um, there are some things that I would be wary of saying, airing our dirty laundry kind of thing. Um, if I say, or if I agree with you that we have an intellectual crisis, does that mean then I'm sort of bad mouthing my community?
mhm,
Uh, well, not necessarily, but the thing is, it's much uh, more important to have a conversation with each other, and
mhm,
be able to say, right, what's going on, what's going right, okay, but what's going wrong, more importantly, because we need to address these challenges. um, if right now, some people are spending their time debating particularities, I don't want to call
mhm,
them trivialities, but extreme particularities of Islamic theology, um, about what does it mean in the Quranic text that God is sometimes described as having a hand, or God's face is mentioned. um, People are having debates about this endlessly, and it's an old debate. How do you understand such texts? In what is the position, the creedal position that has to be observed with regard to that? But people are debating and debating and debating. Meanwhile, there's people who have up in a Muslim family who don't believe in God at all.
mhm.
I don't think they're interested in the eye and the hand and the face so much as they need to be brought back to an essential understanding. So it's a matter of priorities a lot of the time. That a large part of the crisis, if I can put it that way, is a complete misalignment of priorities, and a sense
Mhm.
of looking around you, seeing, read the room, and have a sense of urgency with regards to what we need to address and where our energies need to
Yeah.
go, where our training needs to go also.
Hmm. And one of the places where I think, or the reason that I talk about intellectual crisis, is because I think that there is a big opportunity for the Muslim community to maybe address some of the fears and concerns that non-Muslims have about Muslim society in the West. People see all of the stuff on the news and naturally worry about, what does this mean for Britain? And because I look at the Quran and I don't see any problem with that, I kind of, I'm very uh, excited or very keen to be able to point to something which is happening and say, well, actually, this is a sign that things are heading in a better direction, in a more pluralistic direction. Now, I wonder whether, because people might not know how much diversity there is within Islamic scholarship. It's not like the Catholic Church where a pope decides, okay, this is what the faith is going to be. It's a messy, rational debate between all of these Islamic scholars, and I wonder how you see British Islam. What do you see it having to contribute to some of those maybe more political debates around integration and extremism as well?
Well, I mean, it's important to appreciate the diversity within um, Muslim life and within Islamic scholarship. Britain has been largely, in terms of its Muslim community, made up of immigrant communities. So, a majority of the Muslim community in Britain has its roots in the Indian subcontinent. Um, so, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, some other countries in that area, obviously Arab countries as well. And Muslims, therefore, carry within them some aspects of these cultures that they come from. So they may be well connected still. Some people may have strong links to the quote unquote back home countries. That's not so true of myself. But ultimately, we have within our story the influence of the places we come from and their religious traditions and interpretations as well. So what sometimes happens is the kind of groupings, we could say sectarian, but sometimes less than sectarian, just um, let's say some scholarly traditions, different points of view, different ways of doing things and seeing things. But there are debates that have raged sometimes in parts of the Muslim world and particularly in the Indian subcontinent. And that's how they kind of get transported here. People sometimes are still talking about the same issues. Um, and of course, what needs to happen is that people start to look, more at where we are, and uh, therefore the right sort of debates should be happening. And I'm not suggesting that that's not happening. Actually, I think more and
Mhm,
more people are getting to grips with our current challenges and our British challenges in particular. I am seeing
mhm.
more and more that scholars of different stripes are coming together, talking together, breaking bread, and um, sharing sharing perspectives, but also teaming up on things that are important. So I'm seeing that more and
Mhm,
more. I think we've got a lot to be hopeful about. And then, of course, within our conversation with the broader community, broader society, here I probably feel more pessimistic about how things have gone.
mm.
If I reflect back over the past 20 something years, um, so 2001, I don't know what you were doing then. I was starting university.
I was 7 years old, so I was
Yeah,
in primary three, but I
I was
can
going to say
still.
nappies, but no, primary three. So I was starting university just like in the weeks after the attacks of 9/11 in New York. Um,
I still remember that day.
Right. Okay. So,
Yeah.
obviously it was, sometimes the people I talk to now, they weren't even born then. So it's kind of hard for me to, I became that old man who's like, you remember, there was something happened before you were born. It was very important. Well, it was a pivotal moment, of course, for Muslims in the West. And we then had to rise to a challenge. Of course, a great deal of Islamophobia, which grew from that point. But also, it was potentially it was a great opportunity for us to actually share a lot more about what Islam is about, because Islam or Muslims have been constantly in the news agenda. Yes, indeed, in often in very negative contexts. But if that's what has people asking the questions, then we've got to get
Mhm,
uh, we've got to get organized in order to share with people what Islam is actually about.
mhm. Why are you pessimistic?
Looking at it after these 20 something years, I think it was the moment when the Taliban retook Afghanistan a year or so ago.
Mhm,
Well, Trump was still around, wasn't he? So yeah, 2 years, I guess, more. When Taliban retook Afghanistan, and then I just saw the way that people were talking about Afghanistan. Now, Britain and the US and their allies, invaded Afghanistan some 20 something years ago. Then things have taken their turns, right? But in that time, I think that we collectively as the British society are as profoundly ignorant about Afghanistan and its culture and its religion as we were at the time of invading it. I don't think that Britain is good at learning in this way or interested in it. And I think that when it comes to Islam, the level of ignorance about Islam is precisely as it was.
mhm.
I don't actually think that we've made a single step forward in terms of what is understood. I think this is just me guessing. If I was go out on the street and ask people
Mhm.
a few basic questions about Islam, I don't think they can answer them. Even if it was like, how many gods do Muslims believe in? And I could make that an indictment of British society, but I would make that an indictment of the Muslim community actually, that we haven't done our job.
Do you think that that could change? So, do you see these new religious institutions that are popping up could maybe engage a bit more in mainstream discourse about Islam? And I wonder, like, just to ask maybe a bit more of a positive question, like, do you think there's anything that Islamic scholarship can offer the wider society on some of the political or social problems that we're facing? Things like the cost of living, things like rising inequality, because Islam is doesn't just come with a religious message, it comes with a little bit of a political message as well, in terms of how you embrace charity and how you think of a complete society as functioning.
Yeah. I mean, I would answer both parts of the question in the same way, roughly, which is that I think that Muslim scholars need to be part of an ecosystem, um, and a collaborative approach uh, to studying our situation, and to studying the problems and the solutions both within the Muslim community and within the wider society. And we need to collaborate with those who specialize in all sorts of different things. Um, I don't think that Muslim scholars should, and I don't think generally they do, but I don't think they should just pontificate about matters of tremendous societal importance, without at least consulting with those who have expertise. For example, like you mentioned, some issues of economics, issues, of demographics, and these are social things, political things. To pronounce on things outside of our specialization is always a recipe for disaster. Same as when people pronounce on religion without being specialized in the theology and the hermeneutics of it.
Mhm.
So I think that mutual respect, for specialization is important. Um, I am quite concerned at the fact that we really lack what we could call Muslim think tanks. Whether we call it think tanks or we call it something else, social policy institutes. Amazingly, in Scotland, we have a first minister who is Muslim, but we don't have any think tank which is Muslim, right? And I think it's kind of a remarkable situation we're in, where we haven't actually achieved certain things that I would consider basics for a community like ours. One that other communities certainly have risen to, right? They have recognized these needs. They have invested in the solutions. They have put their best people forward for that and encouraged it. And for whatever reason, and I think there could be a number of complex reasons, the Muslim community hasn't really shown that same level of initiative.
Hmm.
And I would add one more aspect here, which is the cultural aspect. So aside from having think tanks which are going to look at intellectual questions and social policy, we also need to address the cultural question. Um, what really is going to change things, I don't think, is lots of reports and lots of even books and courses and more scholarship and more scholarship. Um, Even though we do need more scholarship, but what really is going to change the culture is culture, right? What's going to move people's understanding is encountering Muslims through our lived experience and through and this is where scholars also need to be open
Hmm.
and ready to engage with different creative outlets, um, and be able to encourage that certain things are permitted or should be permitted rather than maybe putting the brakes on everything, right?
Hmm.
There aren't that many Muslim filmmakers. There aren't that many Muslim musicians. Some people will get upset. I even said
Hmm.
the word, but the point is, where there are Muslims meeting people where they are and speaking to them in languages that they understand and representing Islam within their spheres, people are going to respond to that.
Hmm.
Just in the last week, I met with two different Muslim storytellers. One in Oban, one in Peebles. So I was traveling around a bit, um, and these are both converts to Islam actually, and they are interested in traditional Scottish storytelling. And I just, I just felt like, okay, whether they need it or not, maybe they do, but I felt like my role here as a scholar is to encourage them.
Hmm.
Just say, we need you to do what you do. Um, Maybe it will not have mass appeal compared to someone who manages to make a successful Netflix series
Hmm.
or a BBC Scotland series, whatever. Um, but you've got to explore these different ways of communicating the message,
Hmm.
whether that message be Muslims are okay, Muslims are cool, we can all get along, even if that's the baseline message, that's okay. Or communicating the higher ideas, the things that Islam has to offer society, the things that it has to offer in terms of its beliefs, in terms of the worship, in terms of the spiritual life, and in terms of the practical solutions to some of society's problems. You know, it amazes me that the thing that Muslims are most famous for is not that we are teetotal. Right? We don't drink alcohol. Okay, some people might, but as Muslims as a whole, and that's our very very clear rule in the Quran, that we don't drink alcohol. That to me is something that really absolutely should make us stand out in society, and we should have so much to say about alcohol. The effects that it has on health, the impact that it has on the NHS and the economy. Um, but we are so busy with our sort of being on the back foot, essentially, I would
Hmm.
say, that we haven't presented this message to people. Imagine, Muslims had created an alternative drinks industry, right, which is not centered around alcohol. It's just an idea from the top of my head, but I'm just pointing to how we need to be creative in terms of the solutions that we offer. It's not all about talking, and it's not all about scholarship.
Mhm. I'm just imagining what a Muslim whiskey company or competing with the whiskey industry might look like now.
Well, the sky's the limit.
Yeah. And there's an interesting point about you talked about YouTube, and you've always been Islamic scholar that's more on the end of the spectrum, which is happy to embrace the new technologies. You're on Twitter, getting involved and and making your dad jokes and presenting your studies in quite a humorous way. But then there's also, I guess, like a dark side to influencing, being a YouTube creator, always needing to present things which get clicks. And I wonder, there's been this rise of celebrity sheikhs as well. Now, I'm not necessarily implying that you're a celebrity sheikh, but I am
Far
thinking
from it.
about people who, you know, um, it's not clear to me that that they are devoted to the tradition rather than their own popularity and gaining subscribers and the things that they talk about and the way that they talk about them. Is that something that you think we need to be careful about? And I just wonder if you could tell us your thinking about that, what the
Yeah.
pluses but also the dangers might be.
Yeah, I think we're not talking about just one type of thing here, one type of phenomenon. So I had talked about how there's a difference between being a scholar versus being an imam and having a pastoral role. And there are various types of roles that a person can play. And of course, women as well. Women can be scholars, of course. We don't really have female imams. That's due to our tradition and our
Mm.
various practical matters. I
Yeah,
remember this question.
there's nothing in the Quran that says you can't have a female imam. It's just not a
Well,
lot
in
of
the sense that
Muslims.
it's just not the role that is understood um, in terms of the types of leadership
Mhm,
that women do exhibit. So we have a woman who is the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain at the moment,
mhm.
and I remember she was on
Zara Muhammad. Yeah.
Zara. That's right. So she was on Women's Hour, I think, and was sort of grilled about this. Why are there no female imams? I don't think that's what we're calling out for, but we do need more prominence to female voices on the scholarly level, on the pastoral level, on the counseling level, on all sorts of levels,
Mhm,
and in this kind of community political leadership as well, like Zara is exhibiting. Um, but what we can also identify is a sort of the role of being a teacher, being an educator, and another one is being a preacher, right? So a preacher, basically, I'm referring to someone who delivers the message or messages based on the religion that are supposed to affect people and give them guidance in their life, tell them about things that they're doing wrong, tell them about things that they should be doing better and doing more of. So, being a preacher doesn't require you to actually be a scholar, right? The two don't go hand in hand all the time. You get scholars who preach, yes, but someone who preaches is not necessarily a scholar. And the difficulty is that sometimes people see a person fulfilling one role and they just assume that they are qualified for all those roles. So they'll see someone telling them, you should be good to your parents, fear God, and be good to your parents, and then they'll go and ask them, can I take a mortgage? What's the difference between this conventional mortgage and an Islamic mortgage? And the worst thing is that the person who is asked that question might actually start answering them because after a while they feel like, well, I'm being asked so often, maybe I actually know, like maybe I should share my opinion. And if this happens in this sort of outside world, it happens, of course, on the online world. People end up getting sucked into their own hype. The algorithms work their magic, their black magic, and they cause a person to realize that, okay, when I say such and such, I get more views, I get more hits. I'm going to lean into that. I'm going to be controversial. Um, and I'm going to say things that are not necessarily within my pay grade, which is generally they're not paid, but they're making money maybe through ads and that kind of thing. So someone being a celebrity is not a bad thing. I think, again, in the way that I said, Muslims need to get into the cultural sphere and the entertainment sphere. Some religious discourse is basically entertainment, or is edutainment, and if we see it for what it is, we can live with that. The problem is when that's confused for genuine scholarship, when that's confused for, a person is seen as an authority who does not deserve to be seen as an authority, then they get themselves into some controversies because they speak about things that they don't know, and sometimes they actually court the controversy on purpose because that's what gets the
Mm.
views. So they go after some other preacher or online figure. Sometimes they'll go after the most prominent, well-known Islamic teacher, preacher, scholar, just in order to establish themselves, right? There's an old Arabic proverb, about a man who he once went over to a well and he urinated in the well, right? And he was grabbed and restrained, and they asked him, why would you do that? Why would you pee in the well? He said, just so I'd be known, just so people would talk about me. So that's what I see Twitter X as a lot of the time. It's just people peeing in the well so that everyone will talk about them.
that's that's so funny that it's made me not able to ask you my next question. I think I'm going to get that on a t-shirt. Coming to the last sort of topic that I wanted to talk about, it's to do with how the government in Britain should be engaging with the Muslim community. Should it be encouraging this kind of homegrown scholarship, or should it avoid doing so? And this is an interesting question to me because historically, Islam has always had a little bit of apprehension about politics getting too involved in religious discourse. And I think you're a good example of that, and sort of your reluctance to speak on things that are outside of your expertise. People might not realize, like, that's quite a historical tradition within Islamic scholarship, not to offer up opinions. Um, so I wonder, we've had the government getting involved with things like the prevent strategy, which personally I think probably didn't achieve the goals that the policy had. Uh, what would a better approach look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's an enormous question. You have places where governments take a more hands-on role in uh, in deciding how scholarship is nurtured, and that can refer to Muslim majority countries, and also even there's an interesting kind of development in Germany where, due to some historical reasons of how universities were set up vis-a-vis the church, and due to their kind of equality laws, as I understand, it's now understood that we need to provide the same kind of thing for other communities. So now we have some centers of Islamic theology within a number of the universities in Germany, and this is aimed at producing homegrown imams. I think in Britain we are generally more hesitant to see. Not just, I'm saying, the Muslim community or religious communities are hesitant, but the state is also hesitant about getting too hands-on in such things, and we have our own history and our own anxieties around that. And I think rightly so. I don't really trust. I don't trust the current government, or probably the next government, to be too actively involved in deciding about these things. Unfortunately, I think that because you mentioned the prevent strategy, and the associated counter-extremism approaches. These have done a lot of damage to our ability to function um, and to thrive in terms of Muslim scholarship. Um, the idea that imams should be homegrown, that's something that people do say on occasion. There is sometimes an encouragement from certain politicians, and I think that uh, for my own reasons, I definitely sympathize with that. I don't really like the fact that to a large extent we import imams, be it from the subcontinent or elsewhere, um, instead of lifting up people from this community who have grown up here and have studied whatever they needed to study. Um, and a lot of the times, the reasons for that are kind of economic, and they're to do again with prioritization. Like the Muslim community has within it plenty of money if we want to spend it in the right channels. The Muslim community is famed for being very, very generous in charitable causes, in relief causes, especially when it comes to global crises. The British Muslim community can raise a lot of money, to play our part in relief. Um, but when it comes to running our mosques, we struggle. So
Mhm.
yes, you can raise money for the building, but very little energy is put into raising money for the people, for those who will populate these centers and who will be the teachers and be the leaders.
Mhm.
um, so with that would go training institutions and so on. So we need to do better internally as a community. We shouldn't need any active involvement and support from government. What would be nice is if they stop interfering, because one of the problems is that things that are perfectly mainstream, that are perfectly reasonable, are characterized as extremist. And when this happens, there is this tightening upon the Muslim community. Um, labeling people because they, for example, belong to or have a connection to a particular uh, organization, and therefore they are associated with um, Islamism, whatever that's supposed to mean,
Mhm.
or
Tainted by
extremism.
association, basically,
Yes, yes, and then
rather than anything that they actually think or believe.
yeah, yeah, and there needs to be a respect for the fact that as Muslims we have our scripture, we have our beliefs, and generally the type of secularism that we have in the UK works quite well. It's largely about leaving people alone. But with Muslims, I think that has been overridden by the security concerns over terrorism and so on. The best solution to that, if we are worried about people from this country becoming misguided, being sucked into extremism, being sucked into violence, even, is to actually support Muslim community institutions to do their job well, to speak confidently. If it's the case that imams in the mosques feel afraid to speak from the pulpit about matters that pertain to politics, they may choose to do it or choose not to do it. But if it's the case that they feel afraid because they might fall foul of some laws or some uh, prevent duty or something like that, then ultimately what happens is that it's not the imams and the religious scholars and the responsible leaders who are leading that conversation.
Mhm.
Instead, of course, it will happen, online. It will happen in the corners, in the dark corners, instead of being an open discussion. Mosques are profoundly depoliticized. You know, I know that there's this strange kind of perception that a few people have that mosques are like hotbeds of whatever, hotbeds, not hotbeds of anything, right? Uh,
Yeah, it's just like some people when they're listening to the Friday sermon in the mosques that I go to, they get the best sleep that they have all week.
so like being able to be relevant and being able to say what needs to be said. This is important. when we have that kind of environment, that kind of culture, then we can steer people in the right direction. When you have prominent politicians, even prime ministers, implying that Muslims have unfounded grievances, I'm sorry, we have extremely well-founded grievances, right? I don't think grievance should be the sole factor or the, but when it comes to the political issues, the hypocrisy of our governments, right? Not just the current people in charge, but the ones before them and the ones after them. It happens over and over, especially towards certain causes that are dear to Muslims in different parts of the world, right? So, what's currently happening in Palestine, for example,
Hmm.
seeing the position of our government and even the opposition and their inability to demonstrate even the basics of justice, it causes profound mistrust. It causes a sense of, what future do we have in a society like this? What future do we have to influence things? And I do think that we need to reimagine what it means to have influence. We need to reimagine and really think about how uh, other communities have been successful in having influence on the political level, on the cultural level, on the intellectual level, and really just to get our priorities better lined up as a Muslim community.
Hmm.
That's my perspective.
And the conversation, I think, about stopping extremism or stopping people falling into extremism resonated with me a lot, because it's something that I perceive as it happens to people who are insecure in their faith, especially and insecure in how their faith is perceived in the community that they're in. That's just a personal thing that I think is a factor. And I realize that I've not asked you about your PhD thesis, which I think has something to say about this, in terms of understanding different interpretations of the Quran, but using the Quran itself to answer, well, which interpretations are valid and which aren't. Because we both agree that this kind of violence is completely prohibited in Islam, and yet there's people that think it's completely Islamic. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your thesis and how it might pertain to those sorts of debates within the Muslim community.
Yeah, so I mean, in the research that I do about how to interpret the Quran, um, I really look at that as just trying to get to the fundamentals of how we look at things as believers and how we engage with the scripture and take its guidance. Um, I don't tend to think about specific problems that we have. I think that we've just got a general problem sometimes of a sense of where we get our understanding from, and what we see as the authority in religion. So I think that when people are misled or misguided in different ways, including those who are sucked into extremist discourses, what's happened is mainly a lack of religious literacy. Um, so someone who packages for them, they may well tell them, well, the Quran says this, read this verse, and um, they may well focus on things other than the scripture, actually, about, don't you see what they have done, and this is what we need to do, right? Without having a sense of, okay, but what are the boundaries within Islamic ethics and Islamic law regarding how we are to deal with such situations, um, as as a Muslim global community, and then as citizens living in a country like Britain. So having more scriptural literacy is the kind of thing that I'm really working on these days. I still pursue the kind of higher academic ideas about interpreting the Quran through the Quran, but I'm trying to turn my attention to getting people to just read the Quran. Um, there were a lot of non-Muslim people over the last few months. This big phenomenon that came up on TikTok I'm not really on TikTok, but the next frontier, maybe, God willing, is to get onto TikTok. But as I understand it, there were a number of influencers even who are not Muslim, but they saw what's happening in Gaza. They looked at some images of people who were under such tremendous suffering and oppression, but exhibited characteristics of high faith and certainty in God. And they said, what's going on? What is behind this faith, behind this strength? So they said, I want to know what they have. And of course, it's not just Muslims who are in Gaza and in Palestine, but many of them, most of them are. So they said, look, I want to find out more about Islam. So what did they do? Naturally, they picked up the Quran in translation and they read it. And they were even reading it over TikTok and probably giving their thoughts about it. And some of those would have been wonderful thoughts. Some of them might have missed the mark. I don't know. The point is, I didn't see my role here as to insert myself into that conversation and
Mhm.
tell them where they're getting things wrong. Rather, I encourage the fact that they are having these open conversations. Muslims too need to realize the importance of reading the Quran in a language that they understand. And when they do that, they will just become exposed to what God is saying. They will have the bigger picture. When they read into the Quran and when they read around the Quran in the commentaries that help to understand and contextualize it, then then someone could come and tell you some strange ideas, and you would have enough literacy, enough basic foundation to
Mhm.
be able to tell what makes sense and what doesn't.
So the idea that your internal BS detector gets trained through having more knowledge, basically, so that when you're exposed to those extremist ideas, the alarm bells go off.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. You get some stories about certain people who engaged in certain terrorist activities and so on, but it has been studied, I think. I can't quote anything authoritatively, but it has been studied that some of these people really were absolute beginners in Islamic learning. It's the idea that actually, I'll tell you something that Yusuf Islam said, formerly
Hmm.
known as Cat Stevens, right? So he said the solution is not less religion, but more religion,
Hmm.
right? So people sometimes think that moderation, being moderate as a Muslim or whatever, is about just having enough religion but not too much, right? Don't overdo it. Whereas, of course, becoming uh, involved in terrorism or something is not a result of too much religion. It is like someone's gone off course somewhere, right? The more religious you are, the more that you would actually be at peace with yourself and with those around you, and you understand your actual role. We do need to be angry about what's happening in the world today and what's happening around us. We do have to get active to change things. We have to do that in the right way. We have to do that in ways that are effective, and we have to do that in ways that are ethically acceptable
Hmm.
in our faith. Um, what we don't need is to tell people, oh, don't have grievances, everything is fine, everything's fine. No, get mad, but do it right.
Hmm. So, I mean, you've spoken so eloquently about a lot of the things that we've been talking about. If people want to find out more about the work that you do, I know your Twitter handle or your X handle, I don't know what they call it now. I guess I'm getting old as well. But Tafsir Doctor is,
Doctor, that's right.
yes. And if people want to find out more about your work, where should they go?
Well, we have the Ibn Ashur Centre in Glasgow, so ibnashur.com would be a place to find out about the centre and the work that we do. And generally, social media, always putting stuff out, and you can follow along.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for your time. You've been very generous, and take care.
Thank you, and you take care as well.
Okay. If you like the podcast, the best way to support it at this stage is to tell your friends about it and share it on social media. You can use the hashtag Healthy Discussions or my Twitter handle @MontereyZack to tell me your thoughts about this episode. In the description, you'll find more about our guests' work and their book recommendations. Thanks to Health Education England North East, Health Education England South West, and Medics Academy for supporting this episode. All of us at the Healthcare Leadership Academy are grateful for their support.